I told my wife Emily that my seminar ended a day earlier than planned, but I couldn't change my flight, so I'd be back on Tuesday night. She was supposed to pick me up at the airport around 6:00. She was a bit annoyed about me being away for another night, but she was also really excited to see me. After thinking about it for a while, I realized that I've been away from home a lot and should make my wife, with whom I've lived for 17 years, a priority. I decided to go to the airport and try to change something, even though I was close to giving up. I was pretty annoyed about her being upset with me, but then I thought, hey, I've been away for a while, and she's been waiting for me. After thinking about it for a bit, I figured I'd been away from home a lot, so I should focus on my wife. I've been with her for 17 years, and I decided to go to the airport and try to make a change. I was about to give up, but then I saw there was a flight to an airport near our hometown. The airport I usually use is about an hour north of our place, but the other airport was almost 2 hours south, and I'd never used it before I checked, and there was a flight leaving for that airport in half an hour, so I went to the counter to buy a ticket. The whole process was surprisingly simple. An hour later, I was in the air, and 3 hours later, I landed. I rented a car and figured I'd be home around midnight. Emily was ecstatic about my early return, and I couldn't help but smile. I decided not to call her and wanted to make my return a complete surprise. It was just before midnight when I got home. The house was dark and Emily's car was gone. I thought it was weird, so I brought my bag inside and unpacked, wondering where she could be at this hour. But I decided not to jump to conclusions. I called her cell phone, and she answered on the third ring. I greeted her and pretended to check on her. Well, she said it was well past midnight and that she had been asleep. She said she'd be at the airport the next morning at 6 to pick me up. I was puzzled and curious about her being asleep but not at home. I asked where she was, and I mentioned that I had tried calling our home phone but got the answering machine instead. She explained. She said she was in bed and that our phone wasn't working. There was a repairman scheduled for the next day. My head was spinning as I wondered if she was in bed upstairs. I had been unpacking in the same room and hadn't seen her. It seemed unlikely that she was blatantly lying to me, but I couldn't help but wonder why. I then told her that I wouldn't be on the 6 o'clock flight and that I'd be staying a few more days. I promised to call her when I had the exact time and day for my return. She expressed her longing for me and asked me to come home as soon as I could. I assured her that I couldn't wait to see her and said my goodbyes. As I finished the call, I couldn't help but wonder. I could tell she was laughing a little when I said I'd call her when I knew the exact time and day I'd be back. She said she really missed me and asked me to come home ASAP. I told her I couldn't wait to see her, and then I ended the call. I noticed a hint of laughter in her voice. I dialed my home phone number, and it rang normally. I thought about answering it and having a witty conversation with myself, but I didn't feel like it. I went up to our room, looked under the bed, and checked all the other hiding spots. I thought to myself, ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building. I'm in sales, not rocket science, but my instincts are sharp, and I sensed something suspicious. How foolish had I been? Quite foolish, that was my honest assessment. The next morning, I got up early and moved the rental car to the other side of the street. 7:00 a.m. I saw Emily's car pull up to the house with a man driving. I hid in the junk closet in the foyer with the door slightly ajar. Emily unlocked the door and they entered. She told him she needed to change and get ready for work, and mentioned getting clothes for the next day to avoid. She said she'd be back in 10 minutes and he laughed and said he'd help, but then he'd have to make love to her again. Emily playfully warned him that she'd have to fire him for being late and mentioned that he seemed to enjoy the fact that she worked under him. She also commented on how his wife considered her the perfect secretary. I couldn't help but wonder what she would say to his wife, considering she found him obnoxious and arrogant. He had only been with the company for a couple of weeks, as far as I could remember. He laughed and mentioned that he had already told his wife. I couldn't help but wonder what she would say to his wife, since she found him obnoxious and arrogant. He had only been with the company for a couple of weeks, as far as I could remember. He laughed and mentioned that he had already told his wife about Emily, noting that she was the same age as his wife's mother and much lighter in weight. He joked that when his wife saw Emily, he'd have to fire her anyway. He then added that he had informed his wife he'd be house hunting that week and might not be away from the hotel for a couple of days. Emily rejoined. Then they shared a laugh. She looked stunning, and her boss was named Mr. Boss. They embraced, and he gave her a slow, passionate kiss. I felt tempted to grab an umbrella from the shelf and voice my disapproval. He suggested that she spend the following night with him, going out for dinner and returning by 8:00 p.m. He said he might show her the lodge after talking to the owner. Emily said it was a good idea and asked what kind of tour he'd like, saying, "What if my husband comes home early?" His name was Jeff. Jeff told her he'd call him to arrange a pickup at the airport, but he'd have to give him a day's notice. He said that if I didn't call today, he'd be upset I wouldn't be returning home tomorrow. Emily found this satisfactory and replied, suggesting that I was a seal and that, in the unlikely event of any issue, I'd probably offer Jeff a beer and apologize for any inconvenience. Jeff, in turn, suggested that I sounded like a pushover and that his wife would be furious and potentially cause him trouble if he cheated on her. Emily chimed in. She said that fear keeps most men in line, but he didn't seem too afraid of his wife. Jeff responded by explaining that he'd be in deep trouble if he cheated and would be lucky to save his life. He added that his wife was in Houston, which made him feel relatively safe. That's when I stopped listening as they left the room. My face turned red, and I felt my blood pressure. My wife had been unfaithful, and it seemed like she didn't like me very much. I sat down to think about it, and a plan started to form. I remembered that Emily had mentioned her new boss was being transferred from the company headquarters in Houston, so I needed to find out his name. I made a few phone calls and asked the female receptionist that. My wife had been unfaithful, and she didn't seem to like me anymore. I sat down and started thinking about what to do. I remembered that Emily had mentioned her new boss was being transferred from the company headquarters in Houston. I needed to find out his name, so I made a few phone calls and asked the female receptionist at Emily's workplace a few questions. Emily's workplace quickly gave me all the information I needed. His name was Jeffrey Ross, and he had a wife and 2 teenage children. His wife would stay in Texas until the kids finished their school year, and then they would join Jeffrey in Springfield. He would search for a house every night after work. I searched for the last name Ross in Houston on the internet directory. I found 3 Jeff Rosses in Houston. I called the first one, and it was him. I asked if he was married, and he said yes. I asked how I could help, and he said his wife was working for the Halifax company. I said I was Don Watson from Halifax and that I was planning a party for him and his wife. I told them they'd get round-trip tickets to Springfield as a surprise for Jeff, and she was into it. She asked about the date, but I didn't give a straight answer. I said the event would be the next night, and I gave her the flight details. I told her the company would pay Jeff for the expenses, and I emphasized that need for secrecy, and she promised not to tell anyone. Next, I started calling Emily's friends and family to invite them to her surprise party. I told them that Emily had received a promotion from her boss, which warranted celebration. Everyone was happy with the explanation and the need to keep it a secret from Emily. I asked them to arrive at our house by 7:00 p.m. I wanted to make sure Emily was there, so I called a local restaurant, ordered food and drinks, and told them to set everything up on the veranda next to the living room by the pool. This was a special touch, since Emily had always wanted a party on that veranda. I left instructions for the caterers and explained that the house might be empty when they arrive, but they can set everything up on the outdoor veranda by going around the house. The next day, I got to the airport half an hour early, as passengers were heading to the baggage area. I approached a couple of unaccompanied women and asked if they were Mrs. Ross while talking to one of them. I got to the airport 30 minutes early, and as I was making my way to the baggage area, I passed a couple of unaccompanied women. I started talking to one of them, and I heard someone say my name. She introduced herself as Mrs. Ross and asked if I was there to pick her up. I was almost speechless when I saw her. She looked like a movie star. I introduced myself as Ron and explained that my wife worked for her husband. I decided to think on my feet, as she seemed a bit suspicious. I joked that I was often told I'd married an older and larger woman, but that it was just because my wife had more experience and there was more to love. She thought about it for a minute and then smiled, and I felt relieved. We picked up her luggage and headed to the parking lot. When we got to my house at 6:30, I told Mrs. Ross that it was an outdoor party for her husband and also a celebration for my wife's birthday. As the guests started to arrive, the caterer finished setting up, and I was really impressed. It looked like a first-class party, and I hadn't realized it could be organized so smoothly. By 7:30 everyone I had invited was there. I asked them to park behind the church, a half block away, so our driveway would be clear. I told everyone that I would hide in the living room, and when the guests of honor pulled up to the house, I would turn off the patio lights. This would be a signal for them to be very quiet. We had slide glass doors leading to the veranda, and there were vertical blinds that could be adjusted using cords. One cord opened the blinds horizontally, while another separated them. We also had we used these curtains when it was cold outside. They were big enough for me to hide behind as I reached for the cords of the vertical blinds and the light switch on the veranda. A few minutes before 8, I saw Emily's car pull up in front of the house. I turned off the lights on the deck and hid behind the curtains to make it quiet. The door opened, and I could hear Emily and Jeff laughing. I thought to myself that it was good to know they were enjoying themselves. Jeff was in a good mood. He was eager for some alone time, saying they rarely had a moment for themselves. He helped Emily take off her dress, revealing that she was wearing only a thong. They were both feeling good as Emily playfully took off her thong and commented on Jeff's constant playfulness. He pushed her onto my chair, and they started having sex. I turned on the light. Emily was surprised and asked why I was there. It seemed simple to me, so I reminded her that this was my house, and I pointed out that my name was on the deed. She was surprised that I was back so soon, and I said something about how I needed to go and take care of some things. I offered Jeff a drink, which surprised him and Emily. I could tell that Jeff was thinking about what Emily said earlier about how I would probably offer him a beer if we caught them together. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about it. Then, Jeff's wife suddenly came into the room from the porch with a big purse. He was waving it around like crazy. His surprise left him pretty much defenseless, and he ended up about 5 feet away from where he'd been. Then Emily's mom and sister showed up. Emily, still in her underwear, got a scolding from her mom. She told her to get dressed and jokingly suggested she think about a career in adult entertainment. After the performance, Emily was too shocked to say anything, and when I turned on the porch light, she realized that 20 other people were looking at her. I went outside, grabbed some potato salad and wings, and I got a can of beer from the fridge. I went back to my seat and saw that Jeff was having a hard time sitting down and that Emily was trying to chill. The whole thing was pretty frustrating, and I couldn't help but think that I wasn't the one to blame for this mess that Emily and Jeff had put themselves in. In the end, it was better for everyone to know the truth and move forward. As time went on, things calmed down. Emily's cousin took Mrs. Ross to the motel, and another cousin helped Jeff. He gave her a ride to the motel. Emily's mom asked if Emily wanted to go with them, but Emily said no. Her mom understood why Emily might be upset and said that Emily deserved a good scolding, but that she was already suffering enough. Then they left. Emily hid in the bathroom, and I heard the shower running. I've never enjoyed beer and wings so much. Sitting alone and thinking about the evening, I thought to myself that sometimes in life, everything aligns perfectly, and the plan actually works out. I finished my salad and wings, and then I started cleaning up. It took a while to clean up after the crowd. I had to store the leftovers in the fridge and freezer. It was after midnight when I sat down at the table with the last beer of the evening. I was finally able to relax. Emily came in and took a seat across from me. I asked her if she was happy and if that was what she wanted. I wondered why people started forming such opinions. I questioned whether I had done anything to give them that impression, and I even suggested that it might have been her doing. She responded by I mentioned the incident when I got caught with my boss, and she wondered if anyone would think that's what promiscuous women do. Emily was frustrated that I didn't come to her if we had any problems, instead of inviting the whole neighborhood over. I grinned and asked her if we had a problem. She continued explaining that she never meant to be rude to me and that she never thought I would find out about my boss. She accused me of intentionally hurting her. I pointed out that hosting a surprise party for my beloved wife at our house couldn't be worse. Then she started talking about how she'd been unfaithful outside of our marriage. I told her I knew a lot of people wouldn't agree with her point of view. Then she finally said what I'd been waiting to hear for so long. Emily said that if I'd been around more, none of this would have happened. She said I hadn't paid enough attention to her, and that's why she was vulnerable to Jeff's advances. I couldn't help but laugh. She was trying to blame me and make me apologize for her actions. She seemed so foolish to me. I closed the bedroom door and locked it. I felt a lot better. I felt so free, like a weight had been lifted. I was finally going to be legally free, and I couldn't wait to start a new life. That was a fun story. Now, let's talk about another exciting one. Stay tuned, and let's dive in. I should be at work right now, but instead, I'm surprisingly calm, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of fresh brewed coffee. I needed this to calm down. I've always found this to be a very soothing routine. I used to do it regularly when our kids were young. I'd wake up about an hour earlier than the others and have my coffee while I read the news. I'm actually pretty calm right now, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I really needed this to chill out. I've always found this to be really soothing. I used to do it all the time when our kids were young. I'd wake up about an hour before the rest of the family to enjoy some peace and quiet. It was sort of a hobby of mine. I'm Evan Johnson, by the way. I've been happily married for 25 years, well, I was until a couple of hours ago. We have 4 kids, and the last one moved out last year. The rest of the family just wanted some peace and quiet. I'm Evan Johnson, by the way. I've been happily married for 25 years, well, until a couple of hours ago. We have 4 kids, and the last one moved out last year. My wife seemed to be struggling with what she called empty nest syndrome, so I encouraged her to find a hobby. I think she found one an hour ago. I didn't know his name, she just kept calling him Stallion and urging him on with phrases like, "Do it, Stallion. Come on, baby. I know you." My wife seemed to be dealing with what she called empty nest syndrome, so I told her to find a hobby. I think she found one an hour ago. I didn't know his name, but she just kept calling him Stallion and telling him to do it, Stallion. Come on, baby. I know you can do it. It was weird that the smell of my favorite coffee filling the house didn't interrupt their activities. Usually, when I brewed coffee, my wife, Audrey, would rush downstairs even before it was ready. However, Audrey seemed quite preoccupied, which might explain why she hadn't noticed the coffee smell yet. They continued to talk, and she asked him to tell her how much better he was than her spineless husband, and he replied, "Oh my God, you're so much better." I thought about engaging the safety on my weapon, deciding it was a cautious move. Just in case, after all, her boyfriend was a cop. How did I know that? Because when I got home early, his uniform and gear belt were all over the place, along with all of my wife's clothes. During their passionate exchange, their words were clear, "It's time, baby. Do it for me. Harder." I've never felt anything like this until you came along, and thank God you did. The constant creaking of the bed and rhythmic thumping of the headboard against the wall made it difficult for me to focus on my task at hand. I couldn't be certain how much time I had, but based on how long they were staying in my old bedroom, I didn't plan on going back. I had plenty of time. It was clear they weren't new to this, 'cause I heard my wife saying how she wanted to do it more often. "Damn it, baby, we gotta find a way to meet 2 or 3 times a week instead of just now and then." My wife said that, or at least I think she did. How'd I end up in this mess? It was a bonehead move. I went to work and forgot my briefcase. Nah, I actually left it in the garage because I put it there to rescue the cat from under the hood of my car and forgot about the briefcase. Tabby was our second cat. One cold winter morning, many years ago, I forgot to tap on the hood before starting the car, and that was the end of Clarence, our first cat. There's nothing like the sound a cat makes when it gets caught in a fan belt spinning at about 1,000 revolutions per minute, not to mention all that fur flying around. Clarence wasn't clever enough, and apparently neither was I. You're never going to let that weakling you call your husband touch you again? No, he'll never touch me again, I swear. My briefcase wasn't that important, so I was just going to leave it behind, but I had to visit a client who drove me straight to my house. Tack, anyway. I turned onto my street and immediately saw a black and white police car parked out front. I felt like someone had stabbed me in the heart. I assumed something terrible had happened to my devoted wife. I pulled into the driveway, nearly hitting my wife's brand new silver Lexus LS sedan. Her plaster garden gnome wasn't so lucky. I didn't even close the door and ran into the house, which is how I ended up here, drinking coffee. Take me now, stud. Make me feel good. God, I've never felt anything so good. It was very unpleasant, and instead of coffee, I really wanted whiskey, but I figured I'd still need a clear head. I had to admit that their passionate screams were very disturbing, and seeing it was even worse, but I had to see it, if only to get the necessary video and audio. Honestly, seeing it all. I didn't even close the door and ran into the house, which is how I ended up here, drinking coffee. Take me now, stud. Make me feel good. God, I've never felt anything so good. It was very unpleasant, and instead of coffee, I really wanted whiskey, but I figured I'd still need a clear head. I had to admit that their passionate screams were very disturbing, and seeing it was even worse, but I had to see it, if only to get the necessary video and audio. Honestly, seeing them tumbling around in my bed wasn't the most disturbing part. The most unpleasant part was the verbal humiliation my wife heaped upon me. God, you're so much better than Evan. Give it to me, baby, all of it. Apparently, this really spurred her lover on, because the whole house started shaking, along with the bed, and his swearing and grunting went up a few decibels. Let me tell you, it is a shock when your wife sleeps with her lover in your marital bed, and yes, they did it. My wife was riding him cowboy style while telling her lover how much it turned her on. That's when I ran to the bathroom, bent over the toilet, and threw up my breakfast. I was surprised they didn't hear or smell it. I guess they were deeply focused on their activities. Even after witnessing and hearing enough to convince a jury about what was happening, part of me found it hard to believe. But my wife was 50 years old, and my wife was going at it like a cowboy, telling her lover how much it turned her. Only ran to the bathroom, bent over the toilet, and threw up my breakfast. I was surprised they didn't hear or smell it. I guess they were so focused on their activities that they didn't notice. After witnessing and hearing enough to convince a jury about what was happening, I couldn't believe it. But my wife was 50, and the guy she was sleeping with couldn't have been more than 30. He was in excellent shape, and my wife wasn't much of a match for him. I might not be a nacho man, but come on. Why go for someone else's wife who's in shape? It just doesn't make sense. It seemed to drag on forever, but after about 90 minutes, it suddenly got very quiet. I guess they must have taken a break. Then I heard my wife asking, "What's that smell?" Her boyfriend didn't respond. I just heard her exclaim, "Oh." There was a lot of commotion, like closet doors, dresser drawers, and laundry baskets being opened and closed. I figured they were cleaning up any evidence of their affair. I made a mental note to get tested for venereal diseases. They saw me at the same time, and Audrey gasped because there I was, and her lover did the same. He glanced at his uniform and seemed dejected. "It's not there." "What, your service arm? Your boss took it with him when he left." There was a lot of commotion, closing closet doors, opening dresser drawers, and emptying laundry baskets. I figured they were cleaning up any evidence of their affair. I made a mental note to get tested for venereal diseases. They saw me at the same time, and Audrey gasped because there I was, and her lover did the same. He glanced at his uniform and seemed disappointed. "It's not there." "What, your service arm? Your boss took it with him when he left." Thoughtful. He almost disappeared right in front of my eyes, and then I saw his lips quiver in desperation. He dropped to his knees, losing the sheet in the process. He frantically searched through the pile on the floor. He took this too, I think. He called it your throwing arm. I guess what really upset him was the fact that the serial number had been removed. That's like 5 to 7 years, right there. Former Officer Stad Johnson looked crushed by this revelation. As I said, he's a thoughtful guy. We had a nice chat while you two lovebirds were upstairs. Audrey quickly glanced out the window toward the street. Yes, he took the patrol car too. Your boss mentioned that you were providing security at the construction site. He was going to take your uniform too, but he figured you might need it when you left. Where were you? You could call your wife for a ride home, but probably not. She was too upset about that. He's a thoughtful guy. We had a nice chat while you two lovebirds were upstairs. Audrey quickly glanced out the window toward the streeties. He took the patrol car too. Your boss mentioned you were providing security at the construction site. He was going to take your uniform too, but he figured you might need it when you leave. Where were you? You could call your wife for a ride home, but probably not. She was too upset about that. I emailed her a video. It was hard to understand what she was saying, but it had something to do with her father, who was the chief of police. How could you do that to your kids? She told me about them. You seem to have a nice family, despite the situation. Asian, I was kind of enjoying myself at this point. It was like having a fish on a line, and I was just reeling it in. I'd ask my wife to drive you, but her car's been impounded. What, Audrey? She let out a hi. Audrey, the police impounded your car because they found a couple of ounces of unaccounted for marijuana in the front seat. Sergeant Mark said they usually just write a ticket if they do anything at all, but he felt they owed me something for all the trouble. The police department caused me a lot of trouble, but don't worry, he said. You can probably pick up the car in a few days, after they've done all their forensics. At this point, she wasn't screaming, it was more like a sad moan, similar to a lonely hound howling at the moon. Well, officer, I think it's time for you to put on your uniform and leave. So he did. After he left, my wife finally started talking again. Please, Evie, I love you. It didn't mean anything. It was just a fling or something like that. Oh man, I wish you told me that sooner. I was worried you loved him. Hey, it's time for you to put on your uniform and leave. He did just that. After he left, my wife finally started talking again. Hey, Evie, I love you. It didn't mean anything. It was just a fling or something like that. Oh man, I wish you told me that sooner. I was worried you loved him and were going to leave. May feel bad. I overreacted, didn't I? You know I love you, of course. I love you, Evan. Why would you doubt that? Well, besides the whole infidelity thing, making love to your lover on my side of the bed and calling me a stupid idiot covered in crayon there. Hey, I feel kinda bad. I overreacted, right? I love you, Evan, don't I? Besides the whole cheating thing, sleeping with your lover on my side of the bed, and calling me a stupid idiot covered in crayon, there were a few other signs. Oh, honey, I never actually did that. It was just bedroom talk to get us in the mood. Wait, you said you overreacted, Evan. What did you do? She looked annoyed. Evan, what did you do? Up until now, she seemed to be in shock, but now she was clearly nervous and paying close attention. Well, I'm sorry, but just when I thought you didn't love me anymore, did I send the video to our kids? I just wanted them to see who their new daddy would be. You might have to wait a little while before you call them. They seemed upset for some reason. I thought they'd be thrilled for you. Well, that's what I did. Oh my God, you didn't. I just nodded. I forgot to mention one more thing, but you probably already know that your lover's wife works for the same company as you. I think she mentioned that she works as an executive assistant to the CEO. Don't worry, I told her not to fire you because you'll still need your job even if you get transferred to Little Rock. When I talked to my attorney, she said that since you make more money than I do, you'll be paying me child support for a few years. She thinks it will be around $3,000 a month. I know most cheating husbands won't accept this, especially the macho type, but that won't be me. I plan to take some time off from work and go on a long fishing vacation to cope with my pain, just like the song goes, deep sea, señorita, fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not exactly sure why the lawyer requested a picture of you. She mentioned something about giving it to your $000 a month. I know most cheating husbands won't accept this, the macho type, but that won't be me. I plan to take some time off from work and go on a long fishing vacation to cope with my pain, just like the song goes, deep sea, señorita, fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not exactly sure why the lawyer requested a picture of you. She mentioned something about giving it to your father, but perhaps it was to have it on hand in case any officers wanted to engage in bad things, or maybe it was to see if anyone else was interested in dating you. Nonetheless, I provided her with a photo. I also shared a copy of the video with your mom and dad and all your colleagues. Why were you so harsh, Evan? Well, honey, I wasn't trying to be harsh. I just wanted everyone to dad, but maybe it was to have it on hand in case any office folks wanted to do something bad, or maybe it was to see if anyone else was interested in dating you. I gave her a photo, and I shared a copy of the video with your mom and dad and all your colleagues. Why were you so harsh? Evan, well, honey, I wasn't trying to be harsh. I just wanted everyone to know who your new partner is. Your friends on Facebook appeared to be happy for you at this point. Audrey had almost shut down. She was sitting on the floor, wrapped in her sheets, crying, shaking her head, and murmuring, "This can't be happening to me, all right. It's time to get dressed and prepare your bag. Your parents should arrive soon to pick you up." Pick me up, well, of course you'll need. Hey, so I was thinking, we should probably figure out who your new partner is. Oh, yeah, my friends on Facebook seemed pretty happy for me. At this point, Audrey had practically shut down. She was sitting on the floor, wrapped in her sheets, crying, shaking her head, and muttering, "This can't be happening to me, all right? Dear, it's time to get dressed and prepare your bag. Your parents should be here soon to pick you up. You'll need a place to stay, of course. We'll have to sell the house as part of the divorce." I told her later, "Divorce? You seem to have some questions, dear. That surprises me. What did you expect would happen when I found out? Well, you didn't anticipate getting caught, did you? Should we keep having this pointless conversation for a few minutes?" It was quiet upstairs. She didn't say a word. Aside from the occasional "a place to stay," the house will have to be sold as part of the divorce. I told her later, "Divorce? You seem to have some questions, dear. That surprises me. What did you expect would happen when I found out? Well, you didn't anticipate getting caught. Should we keep having this pointless conversation for a few minutes?" It was quiet upstairs. She didn't utter a word, aside from the occasional "we" and "sob." Why is it that cheaters always cry when they get caught? It's a terrible thing. If getting caught is so unpleasant, then please don't cheat in the first place. About 10 minutes later, she came downstairs, dressed but without her suitcase. "Evan, honey, we're really done." Then I heard the car of her parents pulling up in front of our house. "Farewell, Audrey." As always, I held the door open. "We and SOB, why do cheaters always cry when they get caught? If getting caught is so awful, then why cheat in the first place?" About 10 minutes later, she came downstairs dressed but without her suitcase. "Evan, honey, we're really," she said. I heard the car of her parents pulling up in front of our house. "Farewell, Audrey," I said, being a gentleman. That was a fun story. Now, let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned, and let's dive in. That evening didn't go as expected. The house was eerily quiet, and I couldn't find my wife, Helen, or our kids. Helen and I have been married for 11 years. When I realized the silence, I noticed a note on the table. "Mike, I'm sorry. I can't tell you." This was a fun story, but now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned, and let's dive in. That evening didn't go as expected. The house was eerily quiet, and I couldn't find my wife, Helen, or our kids. Helen and I have been married for 11 years. When I realized the silence, I noticed a note on the table. "Mike, I'm sorry I can't tell you this in person, but I'm too much of a coward to face you. I met someone else and fell in love. The kids are with me and safe. The divorce papers are in the envelope under this note. As you can see, I'm not asking for anything. Helen, naturally, my day and my life took a nosedive. Within moments, I was pacing around the kitchen, swearing, going through the divorce papers, and finally slumping. Helen's leaving me the house and all our money, taking only clothes for herself and the kids, along with their toys. The most infuriating part was the last demand. Helen wanted me to sign adoption papers for my kids, allowing her new partner to adopt them. It felt like a done deal. At least I now know who she left me for, Henry Carlslake. I decided to call my soon-to-be ex. Helen was leaving me the house and all our money, taking only clothes for herself and the kids, along with their toys. The most infuriating part was the last demand. Helen wanted me to sign adoption papers for my kids, allowing her new partner to adopt them. It felt like a done deal. At least I now knew who she left me for, Henry Carlslake. I decided to call my soon-to-be ex-wife. I greeted her with a short, "Hey, Helen." She replied with a simple, "Hey, Mike." I proceeded to inquire about her situation, asking what was happening. Helen explained that she had met someone else and fallen in love with him, as she had mentioned in her note. I responded skeptically, expressing my doubts. "Yeah, of course you did. No one just leaves a marriage and sleeps with a guy. I just hope it wasn't in our bed." Helen requested that I refrain from swearing and act civilized. After taking a shower and changing my clothes, I went out to eat. Since cooking I wasn't in the mood, and the food was just okay, so I decided to head to a bar and have a couple of drinks after the day I'd had. I felt like I deserved it. The guy Helen left me for was the owner of Carslake Construction Company. I had done some work for his company in the past, but that was all. But that was about to change. My buddy Paul saw me at the bar and said hi. He asked if I'd made it back from my family for the night. I said it was sort of like that, and I explained that I'd gone back to an empty house with a packet of divorce papers. Paul said he was really sorry to hear about it. He was surprised to hear that Helen was divorcing me, saying he didn't expect it. I agreed, saying I was also surprised by the turn of events. I told him that she'd moved in with Henry Carlslake, and he was shocked. He asked if it was the same Henry Carlslake from Carlslake Construction. I confirmed that it was indeed the same person and shared my suspicion that she was in love with him. Paul asked about my plans and I declared that I was going to give her a divorce since she didn't want anything from me. I explained that there was another form she wanted me to sign, but I had already thrown it away. Curious, Paul asked about the form, and I explained that she wanted me to give the kids to him for adoption, saying it wasn't going to happen. Paul shook his head and made a comment about Carslake, and I added that I had been scheduled to start. I was supposed to start working for him on Monday, but I decided to find another job instead. In the end, I signed the divorce papers, even though Helen tried to persuade me not to. She eventually gave up when the divorce was finalized. Chloe was 10 and Lee was 8. I wanted to get back at Carslake, but I didn't want to land. I never showed up for work on Monday, and no one seemed to care. My revenge on Carslake happened without me. It came from my conversation with Paul, and word spread. Most local contractors refused to work with Carslake Construction. They saw how I didn't show up for work on Monday, and nobody seemed to care. I was getting revenge on Carslake without even trying. I talked to Paul, and then word got out. Most of the local contractors wouldn't work with Carslake Construction because of how he treated me. Henry found other contractors, but they weren't as good, and the quality of the work got worse. After 6 months, my divorce became official. 3 months later, Helen and Goyuk got married. I took care of the kids for a week while they went on their honeymoon. I didn't do it to help. I just figured a week was better than the limited time I had on weekends. What bothered me was my daughter Chloe's question, "Daddy, why did you send us to live with Mom and Henry?" "What? I didn't send you, your mother took you because she doesn't love me anymore. If it was up to me, you could have stayed." I told her that it wasn't my choice and that I planned to discuss it with Helen. When Helen arrived to pick up the kids, she seemed tanned and cheerful. I told her to stop lying and urged her to tell the kids the truth. I warned her that if she didn't, I would. I mentioned that the kids knew. I didn't ask her to take them in, and that I'd fight for custody if I could. Helen walked away in frustration. Life as a single man felt strange after being married for so long. Some friends tried to set me up on dates, but I didn't feel like dating. I wanted love, but I wasn't in the mood for dating. Little did I know. I knew my life was about to change. My neighbors were Gary and Emily, who had moved in just after Helen left. It was a good deal for them, but their house needed a lot of work. Emily worked as a secretary, and Gary was a retired army man. We got along well, and they seemed like a nice couple whenever we crossed paths. We had a lot in common. But then tragedy struck. Gary had a sudden health crisis at work. Paramedics and a doctor arrived quickly, but Gary was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy revealed he had died from a subdural hematoma. Emily was left in distress and alone. I offered her my sympathy, and since her parents were on vacation, I walked her home and poured us drinks. I listened to her as she sobbed and shared her future plans. Emily cried and fell asleep on my couch, so I covered her with a blanket and slept in a chair in case she woke up during the night. The next morning, as Emily was leaving, Helen was dropping off the kids. "Good to see you're not wasting any time, Mike. Come on, Helen. The poor woman just lost her husband." Helen glanced at me, then turned to talk to the kids. Later that day, I explained to them why Emily was leaving the house. Chloe seemed sad, and I don't think Lee fully understood Emily later. I dropped the kids off, and it was good to see you're not wasting any time, Mike. Come on, Helen. The poor woman just lost her husband. Helen glanced at me, then turned to talk to the kids. Later that day, I explained to them why Emily was leaving the house. Chloe seemed sad, and I don't think Lee fully understood Emily later. I invited her to attend Gary's funeral, which she did, thankfully. In the UK, mortgages are insured, so Emily wouldn't be left destitute. This was little comfort given her loss. Emily's parents returned from Europe and spoke to me after the funeral. I assured them that I would look out for Emily, since, apart from I invited Emily to come to Gary's funeral, and she came. Mortgages are insured in the UK, so Emily wouldn't be left with no money. But that didn't make things any better for her. Emily's parents came back from Europe and talked to me after the funeral. I told them I'd look out for Emily, since, besides my co-workers, I was her only friend. I offered to help with some small things around the house to keep her place in a livable condition. The next time Helen picked up the kids, she stayed in the car, which was fine with me since I didn't want to talk to her. Emily and I spent a lot of time together, not as a couple, but as friends, supporting each other. About a year later, I heard Lee chatting with Emily in the garden. I called out to him, asking him not to bother her, but Emily said it was okay as she hung laundry on the clothesline. I suggested that Emily said she'd love to have dinner with us that night. Lee invited her, and we all had a good laugh. Emily helped me make dinner, and she was clearly a natural in the kitchen. After dinner, she helped clean up and hung out with us for a bit before heading home. I thanked Emily for dinner and for coming, and as she was leaving, Chloe asked me if Emily was my girlfriend. I told Chloe that Emily was just a friend and neighbor, but secretly I thought it would be nice if she were my. I kept that to myself, away from the kids. On Sunday afternoon, Helen picked up the kids. I knew they would tell her about Emily joining us for dinner, and I was right. The next time Helen came to get the kids, she was particularly interested in Emily. I told her that Emily was just a friend and that what I did was none of her business. Helen mentioned that she didn't get everything she wanted. I retorted that she left me for a life of luxury with him and that he could have his own kids if he wanted them. I expressed my strong opposition. He was all about adopting our kids and talking about how he'd messed up our marriage. Helen pouted and walked home, but I smiled, knowing I'd upset her. A year later, I hadn't seen Emily for a few weeks, partly because I was busy working on a house that my friend Paul was rewiring. A young couple asked me to make an offer on a complete plumbing rewire. I accepted, and I had a busy few weeks getting everything finished. While working on the house with Paul, he kept me up to date with news about cars, lake, and other topics. He still had to use a lot of non. I was working on a plumbing rewire for a young couple, and my offer was accepted. I had a busy few weeks getting everything finished while working on the house with Paul. He kept me up to date with news about cars, Lake, and he still had to use a lot of local professionals since most of the local guys refused to work for him. With the work on the house completed, I finally had some time to relax. I decided to take Emily out to dinner, and she agreed. We set a time for Saturday night. When I walked in behind Emily, I was amazed. She was a petite woman with a pixie-cut hairstyle, and the dress she wore accentuated her slim figure. After the work on the house was finished, I finally had some time to relax. I decided to take Emily out to dinner, and she agreed. We set a time for Saturday night. When I walked in behind Emily, I was amazed. She was a petite woman with a pixie-cut hairstyle. The dress she wore accentuated her slim figure. For the first time, I started to feel attracted to her. Dinner went well, and we spent a lot of time discussing our lives. Later that evening, I walked Emily to her door, and she expressed her gratitude for a wonderful evening. I smiled in response, and before I could reply, she surprised me with a passionate kiss that left me breathless. Afterward, she suggested that we went out again to see where things might lead, and she kissed me on the cheek. We did go out again, and this time it led to us spending the night together. Despite her small stature, Emily was incredibly passionate, and it was a thoroughly satisfying experience. As Emily and I spent more time together, she eventually sold her house and moved in. We went out again, and it ended up being a night of good times. I got a kiss on the cheek, and then we spent the night together. Even though Emily was petite, she was super passionate. It was a really satisfying experience. As Emily and I spent more time together, she eventually sold her house and moved in with me. The kids were cool with my dating life, and it was clear that they would tell Helen, who wasn't thrilled about it. She didn't want me, but Emily did. A year after we first hooked up, Emily and I got married. When the kids told Helen, she just snorted and turned away. Emily and I had 2 kids of our own, Gary and Robert, my older children. My kids were cool with my dating life, but Helen wasn't. She wasn't thrilled about it. She didn't want me, but Emily did. A year after we first hooked up, Emily and I got married. When the kids told Helen, she just gave a little snort and turned away. Emily and I ended up having 2 kids of our own, Gary and Robert. Now that they're old enough, they can visit on their own, which means I see Helen less. Years passed, and one day, Chloe told me she was engaged. Her boyfriend, Josh, had proposed the night before. Her dad. I offered to help with the wedding expenses. Chloe said they initially thought they wouldn't need money, but Henry offered to cover the costs, with the condition that he would walk her down the aisle. Chloe refused, and Henry withdrew his financial support, leaving her upset. I was frustrated with Karlslake for his actions, and Emily suggested using the money from the sale of her house to cover the expenses. I hesitated, considering it was her money, but she insisted and encouraged me to inform Chloe that we would cover the expenses. Chloe was thrilled when I told her the news, and we came up with a budget that had everything they wanted for the wedding and stayed under budget. The next day, Chloe told me that Henry was furious and Helen was clearly unhappy. One afternoon, Lee showed up unannounced in our garden, wanting to leave home because he was tired of hearing his mother. Chloe was thrilled when I told her the news, and we figured out a budget that worked for everything they wanted for the wedding without going over it. The next day, Chloe told me that Henry was furious and Helen was clearly unhappy. One afternoon, Lee showed up out of the blue in our garden, wanting to leave because he was tired of hearing his mom. Emily asked if they were still arguing about the wedding, but Lee said it was something else. He mentioned overhearing their intimate moments and said that Henry wasn't performing well in bed. We shared a laugh about the situation, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that Helen had left me for someone who couldn't fulfill his responsibilities when it mattered. Lee decided to stay the night at our place to avoid any conflicts at home on Chloe and Josh's wedding day. Helen didn't seem pleased. Chloe told her that she and Henry would sit behind Emily and me during the ceremony at the church. The service at the church went smoothly. I agreed to have Helen sit at the top table at the reception. Meanwhile, Henry sat with Emily, Robert, Gary, and Lee. After all the speeches, the caterers removed a few tables to make space for dancing. Josh and Chloe led the first dance, and Emily and I joined them, along with Helen and Henry. The service went smoothly. I told Helen to sit at the top table at the reception. Meanwhile, Henry sat with Emily, Robert, Gary, and Lee. After all the speeches, the caterers removed a few tables to make space for dancing. Josh and Chloe led the first dance, and Emily and I joined them, along with Helen and Henry. Later, we found ourselves at the bar. Gary and Robert were sitting with one of Chloe's bridesmaids and her children. Lee asked Emily if she wanted to dance, and I encouraged him to go for it. Helen took the opportunity to approach me, clearly having had a few drinks, and I had a sense that this encounter might not end. Well, she started commenting on Emily and me, saying how young Emily looked and how she hadn't aged despite being the mother of 2 boys. Then, Helen started criticizing Emily's appearance, mentioning her weight and clothes. I reminded her that we were divorced and she no longer had the right to comment on my life. But Helen just kept talking smack about Emily, so I had to defend my wife and say that Emily was more of a woman than she ever was. I even hinted at my satisfying intimate life with Emily. Helen was left stunned as Henry joined the conversation. I pointed out to Helen that when she left me, she thought Helen kept making rude comments about Emily, so I defended my wife, telling her that Emily was more of a woman than she ever was. I even hinted at my satisfying intimate life with Emily. Helen was left stunned as Henry joined the conversation. I pointed out to Helen that when she left me, she thought she was trading up for something better, and maybe she was or wasn't, but I had moved on. I had my own life, a loving wife, and 4 wonderful children. I walked away, leaving Helen and Henry to their own devices. Emily and I danced to slow music, and as we danced, she asked me about the exchange at the bar. I told her to kiss. I was looking for something better, and maybe she was too, but I had moved on. I had my own life, a loving wife, and 4 wonderful children. I walked away, leaving Helen and Henry to their own devices. Emily and I danced to slow music, and as we danced, she asked me about the exchange at the bar. I told her to kiss. I promised to explain later. We shared a kiss, knowing that Helen was watching. After breaking the kiss, I smiled at Helen, who turned away to order another drink. As I looked at Emily, I couldn't help but think that I had indeed traded up for something better in my life.